Welcome to Truth Behind History, where we uncover the hidden forces that shape civilizations. Today, we're diving into one of the most important economic systems that shape the modern world, mercantilism. This economic philosophy dictated global trade, colonial expansion, and economic policies for centuries. But what exactly is mercantilism, and why did it matter so much? Well, if you've ever wondered why European empires were obsessed with gold, why colonies existed primarily to serve their mother countries, or why smuggling became such a big deal, then you're in the right place. Buckle up because we're about to unravel the truth behind mercantilism. All right, let's start with the basics. What is mercantilism? Think of it as the original get-rich-quick scheme for nations, except it lasted for centuries. Mercantilism was an economic policy designed to maximize national wealth by tightly controlling trade and accumulating precious metals, especially gold and silver. The logic? More gold equals more power, and power was everything. But here's the catch. Mercantilism wasn't about wealth in the way we think about it today. It wasn't about economic growth, innovation, or free enterprise. Instead, governments heavily regulated trade to ensure that they exported more than they imported, creating a so-called favorable balance of trade. This meant strict government control over the economy. Tariffs, monopolies, and trade restrictions were all part of the package. And then, of course, there were the colonies. If you were a European empire, your colonies weren't just faraway lands full of people and resources. They were your personal piggy banks. The colonies provided raw materials like sugar, tobacco, and cotton, but they weren't allowed to manufacture goods themselves. Instead, they had to buy finished products from their mother country, ensuring all the wealth flowed back to Europe. So in short, mercantilism was a game of power, control, and wealth extraction, one that shaped global history for centuries. Now that we've got the basics down, let's break mercantilism into its key features, the rules of the game, if you will. First up, gold and silver accumulation. Imagine wealth as a giant treasure chest, and the goal of mercantilist nations was to fill that chest with as much gold and silver as possible. Back then, a country's power wasn't measured by GDP or industrial output. It was literally about how much precious metal they could hoard. This obsession with bullion drove European powers to expand, conquer, and exploit colonies in search of gold and silver. Next, trade surplus focus. Mercantilist policies aimed to export more than they imported. Why? Because if you're selling more goods than you're buying, more money flows into your economy. This meant governments imposed high tariffs on imported goods, making them expensive so that people would buy domestic products instead. Then there's colonial dependence. Colonies were treated like economic satellites, existing only to serve their mother country. If you were a colony, you couldn't trade freely with other nations. Your job was to send raw materials back to the empire and then buy the finished goods from them at a markup. This setup ensured that the European powers made all the profits, while the colonies remained economically dependent. And finally, strict government control. Free markets? Not in mercantilism. Governments imposed heavy regulations, monopolies, tariffs, and trade restrictions to ensure that wealth flowed only in one direction, back to the ruling nation. Even private merchants had to operate within government-approved systems, which led to resentment and, as we'll see later, resistance. Now, who were the real players in this mercantilist game? Well, the heavyweights of European imperialism, Britain, France, and Spain, all built their global dominance using mercantilist policies. These nations didn't just adopt mercantilism, they perfected it using their economic strategies to control global trade and expand their empires. Colonial trade networks were the backbone of this system. European empires created highly controlled trade routes designed to funnel wealth back to the mother country. Spain had its gold and silver-laden ships sailing from the Americas, France controlled lucrative fur and sugar trades, and Britain built an empire fueled by manufactured goods and raw material extraction. To enforce these policies, empires passed navigation acts and strict trade regulations. The British Navigation Acts, for example, made sure that colonies could only trade with Britain, even if it meant higher prices and fewer choices for the colonists. This kind of economic chokehold ensured that all wealth and power remained concentrated in Europe. But as you might guess, this wasn't exactly popular in the colonies. People don't like being told who they can and can't trade with, especially when it hurts their economy. And as we'll see later, this frustration would eventually lead to black markets, smuggling, and outright rebellion. All right, so we've established that colonies were a critical part of the mercantilist system, but let's zoom in on exactly how they functioned under this economic model. Spoiler alert, it wasn't a fair deal. First, colonies were valuable because they provided raw materials. Europe was hungry for resources, literally. Colonies supplied cash crops like sugar, tobacco, and cotton, which were sent back to European markets to fuel industry and trade. This system ensured that Europe got richer, while colonies remained just that. Colonies, not economic powerhouses in their own right. Next, colonies served as exclusive markets. Imagine you live in a British colony and you need tools, clothes, or furniture. You couldn't just buy them from the cheapest or best supplier. You had to buy them from Britain. And of course, these goods came with hefty markups, making sure that Britain profited from both ends of the trade, exporting goods while also importing cheap raw materials. Finally, wealth extraction was a key goal. Colonial economies weren't designed for self-sufficiency. They were set up to serve European interests. European merchants, plantation owners, and governments reaped enormous profits, while the actual wealth and labor of the colonies were drained away. The entire system was structured to keep colonies dependent, ensuring that European powers remained dominant. But here's the thing. People don't like being economically strangled. Over time, resistance to mercantilism would grow, leading to smuggling, illegal trade, and even revolution. More on that soon. Now, if mercantilism had a rule book, the British Navigation Acts were some of its most infamous chapters. These laws were Britain's way of saying, if you're a British colony, you trade with us, and only us. First, restricted trade. The Navigation Acts made it illegal for British colonies to trade with other nations. Even if France or the Dutch offered better deals, colonists had no choice. Their goods had to go through England first. This kept British merchants rich while limiting economic opportunities in the colonies. Then there were ship requirements. If you wanted to move goods, they had to be transported on British ships with British crews. This gave England even more control over global trade, creating a shipping monopoly that further enriched the empire. But where there's restriction, there's resistance. Enter smuggling. Colonists weren't about to let Britain dictate every aspect of their economy, so black markets flourished. Smugglers became heroes in some communities, sneaking goods in and out of ports to bypass British regulations. The stricter the laws became, the more determined people were to break them. This growing resentment toward British trade policies was more than just economic frustration. It was a brewing storm that would eventually feed into calls for independence. All right, now let's ask the big question. Who actually benefited from mercantilism and who paid the price? Spoiler alert, it wasn't an even playing field. First, the winners, European nations. Mercantilism was designed to make empires rich, and it did exactly that. European powers and merchants amassed huge wealth through controlled trade, colonial exploitation, and monopolized industries. The profits from overseas colonies fueled industrial growth, built massive navies, and allowed Europe to dominate global trade for centuries. But for every winner, there were losers, namely colonized populations. Indigenous communities, local merchants, and laborers found themselves in a rigged economic system that suppressed their own industries and kept them dependent on the mother country. Colonies were prohibited from developing their own economies, leaving them in a permanent state of economic disadvantage. And then there were enslaved workers, the ultimate victims of mercantilism. Forced labor, horrific conditions, and brutal exploitation fueled the mercantilist economy, especially in colonies producing cash crops like sugar, cotton, and tobacco. The transatlantic slave trade was deeply intertwined with mercantilism, providing cheap labor to maximize European profits at an unimaginable human cost. So while mercantilism created enormous wealth, it also deepened economic inequality, built systems of exploitation, and fueled tensions that would lead to resistance and revolution. Now let's talk about the long-term effects of mercantilism on colonized economies, because the damage didn't just disappear when mercantilism faded away. First, resource depletion. Under mercantilism, colonies weren't allowed to use their own resources to develop industries. They existed to extract and export. Timber, gold, silver, and cash crops like sugar and cotton were drained from colonies at an unsustainable rate. And here's the kicker. Very little of that wealth stayed in these regions. Next, economic dependency. Colonies were not allowed to develop their own industries, so they remained permanently reliant on the mother country. Need textiles? Buy from Europe. Need tools? Buy from Europe. This kept colonies trapped in an economic cycle where they provided raw materials but never saw the profits of finished goods. And finally, the suppression of local industries. Even when colonies had the capability to produce their own goods, they were often banned from doing so. Why? Because it would compete with European businesses. Laws were designed to keep wealth flowing outward while preventing local economies from growing. This economic suppression didn't just disappear, It left a legacy of underdevelopment and inequality that many former colonies still struggle with today. Of course, when people are backed into a corner economically, they find ways to fight back. And in the case of mercantilism, that meant smuggling, black markets, and straight-up defiance. First, colonial defiance. Merchants, settlers, and even local governments in the colonies resented the restrictive trade policies imposed by their European rulers. The idea that colonies could only trade with their mother country, people weren't having it. They found ways to trade with rival nations, often in secret, to get better deals. Then black markets flourished. High tariffs, trade restrictions, and government monopolies made illegal trade extremely profitable. Colonists, merchants, and even European traders took part in underground trade networks to bypass mercantilist laws, ensuring that goods flowed freely, even if it meant breaking the law. And then there was piracy and smuggling. Entire fleets of smugglers and privateers made a living by sneaking goods past customs officials. Some were small-time traders avoiding taxes, while others, like the infamous pirates of the Caribbean, operated on a much larger scale, raiding and smuggling on the high seas. In fact, some colonies openly supported smugglers because it helped their local economies. This resistance to mercantilist control wasn't just about money, it was about freedom. And over time, this defiance would play a huge role in pushing colonies toward revolution and independence. As we've seen, mercantilism dominated global trade for centuries, but no system lasts forever. Eventually, new economic ideas and changing industries led to the decline of mercantilism. So what happened? First, the rise of economic liberalism. Thinkers like Adam Smith started questioning the entire premise of mercantilism. In his groundbreaking 1776 book, Wealth of Nations, Smith argued that free trade and competition, not strict government control, were the real keys to economic prosperity. His ideas laid the foundation for modern capitalism, where economies grow through innovation and voluntary exchange, not just hoarding gold. Next, industrialization changed everything. With the rise of the Industrial Revolution, countries no longer relied solely on raw materials from colonies. Factories could now produce goods on a massive scale, and industries needed access to open markets, not just controlled trade networks. Mercantilism, with all its restrictions and monopolies, started looking outdated. Finally, the decline of mercantilist policies. As free market ideas spread and industries modernized, governments gradually moved away from mercantilism, lifting trade restrictions and embracing global commerce. Instead of controlling colonies for economic gain, European powers started focusing on industrial capitalism, foreign investments, and new economic models. In short, mercantilism was a stepping stone toward modern capitalism, but once the world realized that free markets worked better, its days were numbered. Even though mercantilism eventually faded, its effects didn't just vanish. It reshaped the world in ways that are still visible today. First, the impact on global trade. Mercantilism created the foundation for modern international trade networks. The forced trade relationships between Europe, Africa, and the Americas during the mercantilist era evolved into the globalized economy we see today. Many countries still rely on exporting raw materials while importing finished goods, just like colonies did under mercantilism. Then the roots of economic inequality. By extracting resources from colonies and preventing them from developing their own industries, mercantilism left many former colonies economically disadvantaged long after European powers withdrew. This has contributed to persistent global inequalities in wealth and development. And let's not forget the political consequences. Mercantilist policies led to resentment and uprisings, with colonies fighting for economic and political independence. The American Revolution, for example, was fueled in part by opposition to British mercantilist policies like the Navigation Acts and heavy taxation. Many independence movements across the world can trace their roots back to economic restrictions imposed under mercantilist rule. So while mercantilism as an official policy may be gone, its legacy in trade, economics, and politics still shapes our world today. So what can we take away from all of this? Mercantilism wasn't just an economic theory. It was a system that shaped nations, fueled conflicts, and left a lasting impact on global trade. It built empires, crushed local economies, and even played a role in sparking revolutions. Today, while mercantilism as a strict policy is no longer in use, we still see echoes of it in modern protectionist policies, trade wars, and economic nationalism. Countries still use tariffs, subsidies, and regulations to protect their industries. So in some ways, the spirit of mercantilism never fully died. But history is more than just looking at the past. It's about understanding how the past still affects us today. That's why we do what we do here at Truth Behind History. If you found this video interesting, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into history's biggest economic, political, and military shifts. And if you love learning about how history connects to the modern world, check out some of my other videos. You won't want to miss them. Until next time, keep questioning the past to understand the present. See you in the next one.